I'm just going to introduce the panelists, the presenters for this panel, right? So we're going to have, and I'm going to present them in the same order that they will be, I'm going to introduce them to you in the same order that they will be presenting. The first presenter is Joseph Enyenyu from Eastern Michigan University, who's going to present on Rodney and the labor question. Our second presenter will be David Johnson from City College, who's going to present on Rodney and the question of African underdevelopment and development. Our third presenter, Michael West from Binghamton University, who will be presenting on Rodney and the question of revolution. And last but not least, we'll have Horace Campbell from Syracuse University, who will be presenting on Walter Rodney and the Caribbean left and the political philosophy of self-emancipation. So we're going to start first then with Joseph Enyenyu.
Thank you. My assignment is Rodney and the labor question. This is probably the most historical presentation in the panel, so it's appropriate that I go first. My presentation will require several operations. Number one, I'll mention briefly that Walter problematized a lot of issues that he focused on. It was not all over the place. Second, some attention has been pointed out to his Caribbean roots and the experience in London, but I'd like also to mention briefly that he continued to become articulate and continued to mature in Tanzania at the University of Dar es Salaam. Walter addressed the labor question first in the context of the Atlantic slave trade. That is fairly well known. I'll be brief there. The big part that I will devote some attention on is Walter, the labor question, and the Pan-African movement. And finally, at the core of Walter's writings and political activism was his concern for the dignity of labor. We'll go through each of those operations one after the other. As far as the problematic is concerned, Walter did not waste time writing theoretical essays, quoting Karl Marx and all that. But in 1979, he simplified his problematic in a manner that touched me because of his simplicity and yet deep sophistication. Walter wrote, and he was talking about how to look at Africa, the Caribbean, and the Third World in the context of global imperialism. He wrote, "We must first of all define the total system within which the colonial economy is functioning. Then we must look at our society in far more detail. Finally, we must return to examine the links between ourselves and this total society. Without these stages, we'll mesmerize ourselves. One extreme is as bad as the other. If we are caught up looking at our society in a microscope, we are not going to see anything. And if we are discussing only a system which is macroscopic and disembodied, we might see something, but what we see would not be reality." So that was sort of a summary of his method in the context of integrating global and local situation, put in a very simple and straightforward prose. Now, based on this, what were Walter's priorities? One of us in the panel summarized this in an article also published here in 1971 by mentioning 3 points: that Walter's first primary concern was humanization of the environment. Second, the dignity of labor. And third, the self-emancipation of the toiling masses. We in the panel share that premise, although for purposes of this panel, we modified it into labor question, development, underdevelopment, and revolution. Walter continued to become articulate and matured at the University of Dar es Salaam in the context of both his writings, academic and political commitment. Again, one of us in the panel knows more about this than me, but you need to know that he was part of an organization called the United Students African Revolution Front at the University of Dar es Salaam. This is an organization that practiced practical politics in the campus. They had a journal called Cheche, later Majimaji, and you need to know that it's a discussion from these forums, usually on Sundays, that actually led to the writing of, that inspired our Europe Underdeveloped Africa with his students as part of this discussion. It's interesting that those whom he gave the manuscript of our Europe Underdeveloped Africa were two of his students, Haji Henry Mapolo, and can you imagine your professor giving you a student a manuscript to read and then appreciate your contribution by saying you read the manuscript in a spirit of constructive criticism. That I think made their day. Again, one of us in the panel knows more about these debates, but I'd like to mention one of the turning points in this debate. It was in 1970 when one of the participants in these discussions, called Isa Shivji, came up with a cycle-style pamphlet called Tanzania, the Silent Class Struggle. And brought it up for discussion, and this was a turning point in the maturity of the discussion. Walter commented on it in an article called Some Implications on the Question of Disengagement and Imperialism. The rest of that debate I'll skip. One other issue that is obvious is how Walter focused on the labor question in the context of the Atlantic slave trade. This is fairly well known, but in discussing the slave trade, he made sure he placed it in the context of the global system. And his analysis and discussion of the Atlantic slave trade took into account that Africa was raided rather than cultivated, that Africa was caught and functioned as a periphery of the American periphery. And then his significant contribution was like labor laws at a time when Africa needed more labor. Many hands make work easy. And also the famous narrative of how the slave trade corrupted and manipulated African social and political institutions. These aspects, part of the teamwork, and Joseph Nkore joined that discussion and debate as well. I said I was going to devote more time on Walter and the labor question and Pan-Africanism. This is important, I'll rush, but Walter wrote some unpublished article called Labor as a Conceptual Framework for Pan-Africanism. I have not yet read it. He was also the sponsor. He called himself the sponsor of the 6th Pan-African Congress that took place in Dar es Salaam in June 1976. Again, one of us in the panel has this in a collection somewhere. Now, in that article, he mentioned 3 points about the direction of the Pan-African movement, how it should go. He said it's important to know which class leads the national movement, how capable this class is of carrying out historical tasks of national liberation, and which are the silent classes on whose behalf national claims are being made. He then gave up an 8-point resolution, out of which I'll mention number 7 of that the unity of Africa requires the unity of progressive groups, organizations, institutions, rather than merely being the preserve of states. This was a significant concern of Walter, Pan-Africanism linked to the labor question, but it can't do everything. Now, there's a gap here that needs to be documented, and if that is done, a new narrative and a more powerful one of Pan-Africanism will emerge. Here are some of the parameters of that. Number one, the Caribbean was very central to the emergence of radical Pan-Africanism from the grassroots. Most of you are probably out of the warning from the West Indies in the 1930s. I have got a chronicle of all these. They happened roughly intensely between 1934-39, with spurts from 34-35 and 37-38. British Honduras, 34. Trinidad, 34, 35, 37. St. Kitts, 35. Jamaica, 35, 38. Guyana, 34, 35, 39. And the rest of the islands have no time to go through. This was part of a larger labor movement. Africa was affected at this same time. And the African uprising of labor from the bottom up intensified in the 40s. General strikes in Dakar, Mombasa, French West African Railway strikes. In all these movements, labor was important, but this narrative also needs to be gendered. Women's roles were crucial and indispensable in these struggles. And I'd like to urge you that this is a crucial component of Pan-Africanism, and it has not been documented well and integrated into the story of Pan-Africanism. Walter had this in mind, but it's up to us to accomplish this task. There was a widespread sentiment after these disturbances in the Caribbean and the diaspora, which has been sung by one scholar, like, proudly we can be Africans. Other factors came in: Italo-Ethiopian War, World War II, the Cold War, and all that fueled this, and also that part of the disturbances of 1968, including the student disturbances here, are part of that wave that inspired black people across the planet. And I'd like to urge you that some of these organizations that we get going to promote Pan-Africanism should incorporate these experiences. One of us in the panel put up a forum on the Kwame Nkrumah festivities, and All Africa People's Conference is also upcoming, and I'd like to see this narrative incorporated. Finally, Walter devoted some attention to the humanization of labor, that is the dignity of labor, and that became prominent in his last struggles and the last major publication that he wrote that covered that aspect, A History of the Guyanese working people. I have several pages on this here, but I will not have time to get into it. But he started working on these themes to sort of capture the dignity of labor and fairness. Also in Tanzania, together with a team of his students, they published articles and monographs on labor migration in the size of the industry. Then he continued with his major work in Guyana on the history of the working people. Like I say, I have a full-scale summary of that here, but we don't have time. But the main conclusion that work reached was that if the Guyanese people could constitute, Guyanese working people could constitute themselves through their own activities, then they ought to have the capacity to self-emancipate themselves also through their own activities. So that is what Walter devoted the rest of his life trying to accomplish. He was behind the construction of the political program of the Working People's Alliance, an early monograph that was written seems to have attached his footprints in it. The document is called Towards a Revolutionary Socialist Guyana, Principles and Program of the Working People's Alliance. Now, the overall theme in Walter's work and accomplishments that I'd like to leave you with is he captured class relations more than those working on social transformation. He was very conscious of these class relations. At a time when if you did work on labor, we were supposed to pick up a factory, look at it in details, a mine, look at it in details, and look at workers' consciousness in a specific mine and stuff like that. He was broader, and that's revolutionary. You need class alliances, you need class offensive against class defense. So he had a very clear sense of the relationship of social classes with the intention of a revolutionary leap forward and potential. And to a very large extent, that was an influence of Cabral, who was one of his most respected comrade in harm. I'll leave it here and we'll be able to answer.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter then is David Johnson, Rodney, and the question of African underdevelopment and development.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mona. Can you hear me? It's my first time sitting before a microphone on the Mona campus, and it's a pleasure. Somewhere around, must have been 1971, a former graduate of the department that's organized this forum, for which I must give them a round of applause. The Department of History, a former graduate, in speaking of a manuscript called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, said, "My aim is to upset and not please the deans of African history at Wisconsin and London." He was around 29 years old, I say, at the time. The publisher of that book, or two publishers there were, Bogle Louverture in England, which came into being, in fact, as part of the making of that text, which tells something about it. My friend here has the original edition present before you. And also jointly done with Tanzania Publishing House, I believe they were called, run by someone called Walter Bugoya. And as new publishing houses, someone within that, Walter Bugoya, I believe, received this manuscript. And he was rather concerned about, what should I say, the work as history, as a serious study of history. And he recommended that the text be sent for review by professional historians. Professional historians of Africa in that period, as I dare say in the present, tended to be dominated by Euro-Americans. And Walter's response was, this would be a sheer waste of time. There is perhaps no one around who combines my worldview with my understanding of the African past. The text is written for Africans and other peoples of a certain literacy so they can understand something about their own histories and experience. But that will not be happening. My very brief presentation or notes for a discussion, perhaps it's best I should call it. It's one that really examines the making of Rodney and how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And what I intend to do is simply narrate somewhat about Rodney's own making as a historian and how Europe underdeveloped Africa, the context in which it involves, and trying to understand something of a rather arrogant, some might think, 29-year-old who could think at that stage that there isn't hardly anyone around who can combine a worldview like that with his understanding of the African past. There's a history of Rodney that's well known in the Caribbean, but I'm not sure it's well known in our academy today, and I speak not as someone who is rooted in the University of the West Indies, but who has some fleeting engagements with it, and at times on the campus in St. Augustine, which I'm a little familiar with. I'm astonished, not just in terms of Walter Rodney, but in so many other figures and events and processes at the lack of not just information, the lack of interest that exists. And of course, I am certainly not one who would blame students for that. One has to take responsibilities of folks like myself who are sitting here and the way in which we conceive education and pursue it. And so I begin at the beginning in a sense. So Walter Rodney, I said, was a student here at Mona. I think in part in understanding him, this particular worldview that emerged, we have to see something of Walter Rodney's own origin in Guyana, in the schooling that he received in Guyana. Because beyond anything, I think in understanding Rodney, one has to understand Rodney is an exceptionally well-trained student. At Queen's College in Guyana, which I heard I think it's Brian Meeks who referred to in his presentation at the opening of the exhibition as perhaps the best school around in the Caribbean in that period. There is a graduate of that school who was a contemporary of Walter Rodney, who might be known, the man of literature in the Caribbean, Gordon Roller, who anyone who knows him would know he's not someone who you can describe in any sense as an immodest person, and he simply described it in a text as the greatest grammar school that existed in the Caribbean in that time. And Walter Rodney excelled in that school among a group of excellent students. I dare anyone to find me a school anywhere in the Caribbean or perhaps anywhere that produces a class like the class of 1960 and 1961. I mentioned that not by way of a celebration of our old colonial schools, although these were schools in transition, but to say something in understanding the importance of that training, which Rodney never abandoned, because one of the things we have to be aware of is to his very end, Walter Rodney was a historian. Is that true? And always remained a historian. Whether he was preparing for a meeting, taking a boat to cross the river in Guyana, he would pull out a text, his comrades would tell you, and he would be there jotting down notes for books that he was writing while unemployed in Guyana. So I'm saying that that experience in Guyana, not only I'm talking about the technical content of that schooling, but also in relationship to the Guyana of that period, which generated the most radical nationalist movement in the Caribbean in the 1950s. As a young man, he was someone who was involved in selling the newspapers or the leaflets distributed them of the PPP. I mentioned that because Walter himself made some of that distinctions at times in terms of his own experience when he came to the University of the West Indies here at Mona, and the ways in which Guyana and the experience of Guyana had prepared him in some ways for reception to certain ideas which he thinks that some of his other colleagues from elsewhere in the Caribbean may have had more resistance to. That is a certain radical tradition that comes out of the European left and elsewhere, a certain Marxian tradition that was present in the political form in Guyana in that period. So there were certain ideas that related to an understanding of political economy, an understanding of questions of class, for example, which I'm not saying that he was some authority figure on it, but at least he would have heard the whispers and such conversations while he was a student before he came here. And one sees the the student that was produced out of the University of the West Indies, and I will run forward, who arrives at the University of London Schools of Oriental and African Studies in 1963 to pursue African history, a graduate work in African history, which he always saw as, in very many ways, a continuation and a missing link of the own transformations that were taking place in the study of West Indian history here in the Caribbean. He came on great shoulders. There were people like C.L.R. James and Eric Williams before him on which he stood, but one interesting thing about their work, and it's part of the limitations of their time, the resources, what was available, but they were concerned about Africa in a way in which they weren't or could not be deeply engaged with Africa itself in terms of trying to understand more about social relations of productions and other issues within Africa. So Walter Rodney was concerned about deepening that particular link, which is absent in particular ways, whether it be Eric Williams, C.L.R. James, and other formidable intellectuals that we can think of in the Caribbean. And it is at the School of African, Oriental and African Studies, he entered a school that was at the time the leading center for the study of Africa. And I dare say that so many of the leading studies of Africa still remain outside of the African continent today. And Walter Rodney came in a period in which Africans themselves, part of the decolonization that was unfolding, had to do with the interrogation of the ideas that were inherited through the whole histories of imperialism and colonialism in that self. He was not the first, as we all know, to be involved in doing that in terms of people from the African world at home and abroad. Eric Williams himself, if he reads his autobiography, he would tell you about his own encounters at Oxford and how he remained engaged in this struggle with a certain hegemony, whether it be from Hegel to Hunt and others with which he was engaged. Rodney's own particular battle at the School of Oriental and African Studies was one for which he was well prepared. I once met a classmate of his in Nigeria who described him as a fire eater in the classroom. The seminars that were held in which graduate study really took place at School of Oriental and African Studies, because it was a zone of contestation. Again, I think also significant to understand about Walter. We are here celebrating the interaction of that effort in the classroom and the ways in which that's linked to peoples outside of the communities in which is the way Rodney was always connected. But one has to understand that Rodney also profoundly understood that part of this struggle that we address is one that's concerned with the battle of ideas that we must continue to wage and seek to be able to have our own representation in it. At SOAS, he found himself confronted by those who were seen as the proprietors of the study of the African past. John Fage, Roland Oliver, you can name them. But he came as someone, this is someone who was involved in C.L.R. James study group, someone had a certain perspective and understanding of a much broader narrative about African history. Important part of that narrative, my brother here, Joe, has already referred to, is the ways in which he understood the ways in which he sought to locate the African past with which he was concerned in terms of the whole history of the modern era. And that modern era has to do with the rise of capitalism. And that's the way in which Rodney located his work. And it is what brought him, I wouldn't say into conflict, but brought him into this contestation with the established figures of the study of Africa and that exists up until today. And there were two broad schools that developed around his particular concerns with question of slavery and the slave trade in which it related to Africa. From very early on, if you look at the text like How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, some see it as really representing a kind of a rupture and a break with Rodney's earlier work that he did at the School of Oriental and African Studies that was centered on the history of the Upper Guinea coast. But a close reading of that text shows that the book itself, you can see the embryo of some of the ideas that are put forward in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Importantly, from that period, Rodney is concerned with trying to understand the ways in which these early links of trade that are established with Africa along the coast, how it begins to affect relations within Africa, the kind of changes it begins to bring about within African society itself. So he's saying that by the end of the period of the Atlantic slave trade, we cannot simply understand the Atlantic slave trade as we have to understand the ways in which so-called this domestic slavery that existed in Africa, how that in itself has been transformed by the experience of Africans' interaction with the Atlantic slave trade in the period. So that his understanding of the transition that takes place thereafter that we see in how Europe underdeveloped Africa, the transition from slavery to colonialism, which in the old tradition of a place like School of African, Oriental, and African Studies would see it in terms of this rupture. We have Africa of the period of the Atlantic slave trade, then we have Africa of the period of colonialism. What Rodney is saying is that that's not necessarily a sharp break. Although there are important transformations we have to look at in the period of colonialism, because this direct intervention now involves them more directly involved in terms of seeking to transform African societies towards their own particular objectives. But what he is saying is that by the time that colonialism begins, the anthropologists and others who are busily, and the colonial intelligentsia who are busily around trying to understand tribes and African traditions, etc. in the continent, he is saying that we have to understand how what we are calling tradition in that period, how that in itself has been disrupted by the previous experience that went on during the era of the Atlantic slave trade. So the role of slavery and the slave trade is quite central in his own understanding of the whole histories of questions of African development and underdevelopment. And I'm saying he's not unique in that sense. He comes from a tradition that has already acknowledged that. The distinctive contribution that he begins to make is the ways in which he begins to see how did Atlantic slavery and the trade transform African societies in the period. And then, of course, there is the period of colonialism that goes on. How much time do I have left there? 1 minute. And I'm throwing these out for discussion also. The period of colonialism itself, what he articulates in that text is the ways in which colonialism that represented a new form of expansion of colonial capitalism in Africa, the ways in which it did not carry out the kind of historic task that capitalism carried out in other parts of the world. And in this, the Cabral, who was just mentioned here, is very important in understanding Rodney in that. Because like Cabral, what he saw is that capitalism itself, which orthodox and traditional Marxist thought sees as a very progressive in terms of the transformations it carries out with technology, the rise of the bourgeoisie and elsewhere, the ways in which it operates on the African continent is ones which really represents a block on the development of the productive forces in the continent. And it's in those relationships that he begins to theorize on questions of development and underdevelopment. We live in an era, of course, which we see no alternatives, and one in which in many ways goes back to those ideas that Rodney found so entrenched when he arrived at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Ideas that essentially saw the ways in which capitalism continued to represent a progressive force in these societies, and indeed one of the benefits that came out of it was the colonial project. Rodney was continually concerned with the ways in which it in fact interrupted the historical, interrupted development in African continent. And of course, if we want to talk about new forms of development, we have to talk about alternative forms to particular forms of capitalism in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter, it's Michael West, Rodney, and the question of revolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for your department for organizing this event, formerly the Department of Walter Rodney. I'll be brief because I have to make room for the esteemed Professor Campbell. I can also afford to be brief because, well, brevity comes naturally to me. Rodney once wrote that the only great men, he meant to say, or should have said, women and men, but he wrote that the only great men among the unfree and the oppressed are those who struggle to destroy the oppressor. And that precisely is the point of revolution. Destroying the system of oppression, which always involves destroying the oppressor socially, and sometimes also physically when he gets in the way. Rodney himself was physically debarred from Jamaica, as is well known, some 50 years ago, accused by the JLP government of fomenting revolution. Some days before he was turned away from Norman Manley, or the since renamed Norman Manley International Airport, Rodney, appearing at a Black Power meeting in Canada, had given a speech entitled African History in the Service of the Black Revolution. It is significant that neither Norman Manley nor his son Michael, who succeeded him as leader of the opposition PNP, had a good word to say about Rodney in 1968. Seemingly, the entire Jamaican political class, the government and the parliamentary opposition alike, feared the power of African history and trembled at the thought of African history subserving revolution, least of all the Black Revolution. Some months before being rudely booted from Jamaica, Rodney had published his first study on his first significant study, I should say, on revolution. Naturally, the study was about Africa, an article called Jihad and Social Revolution in Fouta Djallon, West Africa. Significantly, this article appeared in a journal that was based in Africa and edited by Africans. Rodney always affirmed the maxim of Africa for the Africans, including in the organization and dissemination of knowledge about Africa, past and present. He was forever linking the past and the present, Rodney, hence his interest in Cuba. Rodney, in fact, was in love with Cuba. More accurately, Rodney was in love with the Cuban Revolution. Evidence of that love affair is not far to seek. So there was Rodney venturing to Cuba as a UWI undergraduate, returning to Jamaica laden with revolutionary literature, which the immigration authorities promptly seized. It would be the first of many visits he'd make to Cuba. Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, appears prominently in the key discursive artifact that came out of Rodney's expulsion from Jamaica, namely the masculinist titled Groundings with My Brothers. Except Rodney was too optimistic and indeed greatly overestimated the capacity of the Cuban Revolution to resolve the race question, which is to say the Africa question on that island. Cuba reappears, although less prominently, in Rodney's writings on Bolshevism, namely the recently published book, The Russian Revolution, A View from the Third World. And here it is, just came out maybe 2 or 3 months ago. The Russian Revolution, A View from the Third World. The main point of this book, The Russian Revolution, I should say the main point of comparison in this book is the French Revolution, with some attention to the Chinese and Cuban revolutions. Curiously, strangely, there is one revolution on which Rodney is quite silent in his texts on the Russian Revolution, and about which indeed he has little to say, evidently, in his other writings. I refer to the Haitian Revolution. Now, it is arguably the most cataclysmic and transformative event in the whole history of the post-colonial, I should say the post-Columbian, not post-colonial, the post-Columbian Caribbean, the Haitian Revolution. The runner-up would be perhaps the Cuban Revolution. Yet Rodney, who held forth on African history in the service of the Black Revolution, Rodney, the foremost chronicler and theoretician of the African Revolution to emanate from the Caribbean, Rodney, analyst of world revolution from an African perspective, Rodney, interlocutor of the author of the Black Jacobin, Jacobins, which places the Haitian Revolution in world historical perspective, how did it come to pass that this same Rodney was so inattentive to the Haitian Revolution? It remains the case that Haiti has little place in Rodney's most systematic compositions, compositions on revolution. It is a curious thing at which one marvels indeed Rodney's virtual neglect of the Haitian Revolution. It is less curious that Rodney, tender of the revolutionary vine, eventually became a catalyst for revolution in his native Guyana. A good deal has been said here at this conference in the past days about Rodney, the post-colonial nation state, and nationalism. Repeatedly, Rodney was a victim and survivor of national chauvinism. He was victimized by national chauvinism in its rawest and ugliest forms right here in Jamaica. But truth be told, Rodney also ran headlong into national chauvinism, albeit in a less virulent and vulgar form in Tanzania, which, unlike Jamaica, claimed some revolutionary values, and where again, unlike in Jamaica, Rodney had allies in high places, namely in the state party apparatus, at least for a while. As an exponent of the global African permanent revolution, Rodney was interdicted by national chauvinism or chauvinistic nationalism, hence his decision ultimately to appear to Guyana, a country in which, as an adult, he had actually never lived. It was in Guyana, too, that Rodney really earned his spurs as a practitioner as well as a theoretician of revolution. It is evident that as a revolutionary on the Guyana battlefield, Rodney erred. Someone has said that he was no Lenin, whose revolutionary exploits Rodney captures in this book. A more apt comparison, perhaps, would have been the martyred Moïse of the Haitian Revolution, who was executed by Toussaint Louverture for his support of permanent revolution. Actually, it is not that Rodney did not understand the question of revolution, as the Lenin comparison claimed. It is rather that Rodney rejected revolutionary privilege to the point of putting not just his money, but also his neck where his mouth was. He rejected personal impunity from the consequences of his actions, his policies, and his decisions. And that, the rejection of personal privilege in the context of revolutionary leadership, may ultimately be Rodney's most enduring legacies in and out of the Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next and last presenter is going to be Horace Campbell, Walter Rodney, The Caribbean Left, and the Political Philosophy of Self-Emancipation. All presenters were given like 15 minutes. Given that Michael was a bit brief, you have 20.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Morning, everybody. Yeah, because Michael yielded the time. Okay, well, it's up to you. I can stop whenever you want. You can stop me if you want. Rupert, I can stop whenever you want. Okay. Now, I must say how pleased I am to be on this panel, because my comrades, Michael West, that you've just heard, David Johnson, and Joe, are comrades that we've been working with for more good 40 years in what we call the Rodneyite tradition. And in fact, the work that they've done on the question of African history that David Johnson and Michael West referred to, they did what we agreed on more than 30 years ago. That it's not just good enough to talk about Walter Rodney, but to carry forward what he believed in. And Michael and David and Mishir Mugo at the African Studies Conference in 1995 took on the question of how African history was represented, as David Johnson spoke about. And there was consternation among the Africanist scholars because they called David and Michael kamikaze, to say, for you to go up against those major scholars of African history and to promote Walter Rodney, you're ruining your career. And I'm saying it is they are still standing as human beings. There was nothing kamikaze about defending what Walter Rodney stood for. My task has been made a bit easier because although we did not plan to be on the same panel, the topics that were covered in relationship to the dignity of labor, the question of how Rodney inserted himself in society as a historian, and the question of revolution, these were things that I was hoping to raise in the remarks I'm making on Walter Rodney, the radical left in the Caribbean, and the political philosophy of self-emancipation. Every day we get news about why it is we need to change the mode of human organization that we are involved with now. Every day. Most recently, the news of Hurricane Florence used superlatives to describe the impact and nature of current hurricanes. 2 weeks ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change brought out the report on climate change 1.5 degrees Celsius. The context of the report was to provide a special report on the impact of global warming in 2040. The report was emphatic in detailing the greenhouse effects and how hundreds of millions of lives are at stake. It says, avoiding that scale of suffering that will come requires a thorough transformation of the world's economy. That's what we want to talk about. The relationship between self-emancipation and a thorough transformation of the world economy. What kind of social transformation is necessary? Because the challenges of thorough transformation of the world economy brings together the ideas of what is the mode of economic organization that must be undertaken immediately. In other words, we have the objective conditions for social and economic change, but the ideation system and the cultural patterns of the era of what is called modernity holds back our potential as human beings. It devolves to those who are in literature. There's a Caribbean writer who talks about hurricanes as revolution. Zora Neale Hurston, in her novel, The Eyes of Watching God, used hurricane as a metaphor for why we must make these fundamental change. So if I get to my conclusion, I want to talk about, Sam Mermin says, well, no, it may not be time for socialist transformation, but we must fight for state capitalism and social justice. In other words, the state in the way it is organized should reflect the aspirations of the people. So the challenge of this conjuncture is how do we conceptualize those forms of politics, the ideas, and the organizations that can take us to the point of transforming society so we can have a planet Earth in 2040. So that 50 years ago we talked about the confrontation in Jamaica. Will we be talking 50 years from now in the same way? So the project then is a project of emancipation. How are we going to carry forward this project? The project is self-organization. The philosophy is self-emancipation. What is the leadership? The leadership in the realm of ideas, the ideation system and the political philosophy that can extricate us from the ideas of progress that came from Europe. So Walter Rodney, in his life, came out of that left, and David Johnson has already talked about the context in the Caribbean that provided that left. Though there are differences in the Caribbean in scholars about the left. There are some who says the left has been liquidated. That's one of the positions. The other position comes from people like UWI. Well, the left cannot be liquidated because the left comes from the people. And as long as the people are there, as what UWI says, in the 70s, many movements of the left developed. These movements had all a standing in their societies as a kind of collective personality in the whole region. And part of the reason the task of the left remains firm is that the elementary tasks in the Caribbean have not been carried out. The elementary task, that is, decolonize the Caribbean. How do you end colonialism in Cayenne, in Martinique, in Puerto Rico, and in those territories where Europeans continue to hold on to this outmoded concept of colonialism? So the Caribbean left that had its early motivation in anti-slavery, anti-colonialism still exists, as Quina says, in terms of part of the collective personality. And I refer you to this interview of UC Quina by Sir Abraham, The Left Legacy in the Caribbean. This is a very important work. So my starting point on self-emancipation is that where Walter Rodney drew from the enslaved people in the Caribbean. And there's a book in Jamaica called by Richard Hart, Slaves Who Abolished Slavery, Blacks in Rebellion. The idea of self-emancipation, self-organization comes from the enslaved in the process of organizing for freedom. So there are 6 or 7 points on which self-emancipation stands. First, and most important, anti-slavery, anti-colonial, anti-racist, and anti-imperialism. The second, the question of peace and social justice in the region. Third, anti-genocidal economics. We don't call it economics anymore. The rapacious nature of the capitalist mode of production and the IMF campaigns. Fourth, the anti-sexist and anti-homophobia. Fifth, the Pan-Africanist and African Revolution. And sixth, reparative justice and repairing the earth. Now, of these 6, all of these comes out of social movements in many different forms. And Joseph has already spoken at some length on the movement of the workers, small farmers, traders, and cooperative movement. And so I will not have to deal with that question of the self-emancipation of the working peoples, although that question of the nature of the organization of the working people has been dealt with in great detail in Walter Rodney's view of dealing with the history of the Guyanese working peoples. And to talk about the working peoples and not the working class was to talk about how the peoples of the Caribbean were inserted in the global economy. So of these 6 principles of self-emancipation on which Rodney learned from and grew into, Rodney was weakest in relationship to the 4th. That is the women's movement, anti-sexist, and anti-homophobia. Of these, 30 years ago, the anti-homophobia strand of the left was not yet clearly articulated, and the oppression in this area is so great that there is silence on this question. All over the Caribbean, those who call themselves left are complicit in being silent when people are being killed because they are involved in same-gender relations. And so this is one of the tragedies of the left, that they have not yet had the courage to come out against the most backward forms of oppression of other human beings. Quina said clearly that he learned a great deal from Andaye and from other women of the Red Thread movement, and the contribution that they've made is still not yet documented. I encourage you to read the article by Alisa Trotz on the Red Thread and its importance in relationship to supporting new concepts of organization of women and the multiracial alliance. So Walter Rodney started in his life in reflecting on how to humanize the planet Earth and having dignity of human beings. And David Johnson went into details about where the ideas that Rodney got from studying Africa, in studying the history of the Upper Guinea coast. And Quina is the one who told me that when Walter Rodney was searching for a topic for his thesis, it was his reflection on his time with the Rastafari in Jamaica as a student that influenced the choice of his thesis. Because as David Johnson pointed out, Rodney was trying to understand the social formations in Africa and the nature of African societies before the intervention of Europe and the consequences that those interventions had on African peoples. In other words, what were the lessons of social collectivism that we can learn from the African peoples? Rodney was trying to break the intellectual subservience to everything Europe. Yes, Rodney called himself a Marxist, but he was not a Marxist within the tradition that tried to fit everything African into the European stages of development. If Europe had feudalism, Africa had feudalism. If Europe had slavery, Africa had slavery. Rodney was trying to say we must look at the specificity of the history of the peoples of Africa. And this is what he did in his work on In the Ground Into My Brothers. He said, and I quote, "Sometimes it is felt that only in large political states one can find cultivation and culture." Well, that is wrong. In great political states of Europe and Africa today, many human values have been destroyed, while even the smallest African village was a place of development of the potential of the individual. Certain things were outstanding in the African way of life, whether in small or large communities. The distinctive things in the African way of life amount to African culture. Among the principles of African culture are the following: hospitality, respect, especially for the elders, the importance of the woman, humane treatment of lawbreakers, common use of land, spiritual reflection, constant employment of music, especially drums and bright colors. He repeated this theme over and over again, and we saw it in this document called Africa History in the Service of Black Liberation that he wrote in that pamphlet, The Groundings with My Brothers. And what we need to do is to excavate those ideas as how Africans mapped the ideation scale on the social scale through African fractals, fractal thinking and African optimism as it manifested itself in African fractals. How can we link fractal thinking, that is the link between humans in the environment, and the ideas of Ubuntu, that I'm a person because you're a person? Today, the advanced capitalist societies in modern technologies are trying to understand those ideas that came from the African villages, and they're going into African languages to study the cognitive skills of Africans and understand the first peoples of Africa to get the better understanding how to organize and program robots for the 21st century in the era of singularity. The four major technologies: information technology, biotechnology, nanotechnology, cognitive skills. They're going to African villages, and the African youth draw from that, and they came up with Wakanda. They came up with vibranium to tell us that we have to go back to the African peoples to be able to draw from those knowledges and skills. And one of the things we do not see in the reparations movement in the Caribbean, how we have to go back to those forms of human organization that can break the exploitation of the majority of the people. Thank you. See, I have 5 minutes left. Joseph already talked about the global Pan-African struggles, so I won't have to go into that question. Let us now turn to the question that is central, the question of the self-emancipation of the people. Self-emancipation of the people. I spoke about the leadership of Walter Rodney, and one of the things that comes up time and time again is the leadership that Walter Rodney was expressing, that David Johnson spoke about. This confidence of a 29-year-old say that nobody in the academia can be able to advance a statement of how this book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It seems to me that the debates about the assassination of Walter Rodney is an attempt to assassinate the intellectual contribution of Walter Rodney. To say Walter Rodney was a populist. Whenever you hear people make reference to this statement by C.L.R. James about Walter Rodney, that he should not have been there, say, oh yeah, Walter Rodney was a populist. He did not understand avant-gardism. And so within the context of the ideas of revolutionary change, Yusuf Kwayana intervened in a way which brought out the humility of Rodney, yet the clarity with respect to social change. So Rodney spelled out his ideas about social revolution and self-emancipation in this book, The Russian Revolution, A View from the Third World. And Rodney says, from his perspective, Rodney stressed more than most revolutionaries the positive nature of spontaneous struggles. He did not believe that any struggle or outbursts of struggle should be dismissed as spontaneous simply because it had not been organized by a political party. So why do we have to study the history of spontaneity today? Why do we have to understand what Rodney was trying to do? Because what we've seen, that the Caribbean left has not studied the forms of organization in the Caribbean. The Caribbean left has not put the question of the implosion in Grenada on the microscope for us to understand the nature of the defeat of the Grenadian Revolution. And we believe that at this time, if we're going to move towards a new mode of political organization, we have to talk about what happened in Grenada. We have to sum up what happened in Grenada, and we have to say what were the ideas that held back the people of the Caribbean in terms of the vanguardism that was expressed by certain elements within Grenada. I've heard that Bernard Card has written a book on the Grenadian Revolution. I've not yet seen that book, but I think it should inspire a major discussion on the questions of how we go forward on revolution in the Caribbean. As Rodney himself said, there's both from a theoretical point of view as well as from the point of view of anyone engaged in politics, a clear distinction between spontaneity in protest and spontaneity in the organization of that spontaneity and the self-organization of the people so that they can carry themselves from one state to another. Here Walter was operating fractal idea. How can the people, through a recursive process, take themselves to one level of struggle to the next? So let me move to the conclusion. The key elements of self-emancipation. The key elements of self-emancipation: self-organization of the people, self-cultures of the people, political education of the people, the politics of inclusion, Western thinking, Western individualism, Western positivism. They're all based on a hierarchy of human beings. This hierarchy provides the politics of exclusion, and so politics is not open to all groups. Walter Rodney was very clear we had to get to the minds of the young. So in terms of trying to inspire the young, he set about in his last job of writing children's books to get to the youth. He wrote 2 of these books, Kofi Badu out of Africa and Lashmi out of India, because Walter Rodney wanted the people to understand that using ethnicity and those ethnographic forms of study is to reinforce divisions inside the people so that the people cannot organize themselves. And then, I have 1 minute.
30 seconds.
All right, yeah, I can end. So I've already mentioned self-emancipation and emancipation of women and the role of the red thread and what Kwayana said about them. Yeah, let me conclude about the contribution of the Caribbean people, because we're at another conjuncture in terms of where we're going in the world. We are at another conjuncture. in terms of where we're going in the world. The Caribbean supported the African Revolution. And this year, although we don't hear about this in the universities in the Caribbean, it's 30 years since the victory of the Caribbean people and African peoples at Kutcona Valley. Kutcona Valley changed the history of the world and changed the history of Africa. It was at Kutcona Valley in 1988 where the Cuban people and the African people defeated South African apartheid. We don't talk about these things because we are supposed to be pessimists. We're not supposed to understand the positive examples of Caribbean embrace of African revolution and revolution. I believe that this publication of this book, The Russian Revolution, Views from the Third World, has brought us to the point where we can understand the conjuncture that we're in at the present moment from the crisis of capitalism. And we need to go back to those ideas that Walter Rodney articulated in the principle of self-emancipation for us to think through the kinds of organizations and the formations that can take us to the next round to transcend the barbarism that is going to be weighing down on human beings. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much to the four presenters. And now we have to let the people speak. And we can take like 3 or 4 questions, comments at a time. Anybody who wishes to say something now, ask, comment, I'm asking you to please introduce yourselves, go to the mic, go to the mic, introduce yourselves, and keep it as brief as possible so we can take, we have about 20 minutes.
Good morning, Roberta Kilkenny. I would like to thank my brothers for their various presentations. I think it was very informative and helpful in our efforts to also move forward. I would like to make a contribution, not a criticism of the things that were said, in order just to elaborate on some of the points. The first has to do with Walter's choice of study in graduate school. And while it, yes, grew out of a sense that our African history had been overlooked, it is also not a coincidence that he chose to focus on countries of Africa that were then part of the struggle against Portuguese colonialism. It is seldom mentioned that he did research on Angola as well as on Guinea and published them at these times, because in the spirit of Cabral, Walter always felt that his academic skills should be put to the purpose of liberation, right? It was not an esoteric exercise. It was something that was always linked to the liberation struggle. And this is why while living in Tanzania, much of his work focused on Tanzania and not on other, except for how Europe, underdeveloped Africa, which is a more general thing, much of his writings during that time were a contribution to the development of Tanzania. But it was also while he was living in Tanzania that he worked with the liberation fighters from other parts of Southern Africa who were then given refuge in Tanzania. And I think that was as important a part of his life in Tanzania as his involvement with the university and with other academicians at the university. The political platform of the WPA that was referenced, while I do not want to diminish Walter's contribution in any sense, I suspect the comment that was made has to do with the pro-socialist content of that party platform. That platform grew out of months and months of discussion at all levels of the party. And in particular, the socialist contributions came not only from Walter, but also from Brother Kwayana, who was mentioned by Horace, from Sister Andaye, and from Rupert Rupnarayan, as well as a number of others of us who contributed to those conversations. With respect to the jotting of notes as Walter traveled, it may not have been as obvious to some of the other observers that many of those notes were not things that occurred to Walter as he was traveling, but grew out of conversations that he was having with the working people of Guyana, particularly during the 1978 sugar workers' strike, when we traveled from area to area where Walter was asked to speak by the sugar workers themselves. He would also take the opportunity to discuss with them the ideas that would eventually become part of a history of the Guyanese working people. And he would jot down the contributions made by the sugar workers in these conversations. So it was a dialogue that was going on, and it wasn't just what Walter was thinking of at the time and writing it down. I might also mention that this thing of jotting down was something that Walter, in some ways, perhaps learned from Ayusi Kwayana, who also was constantly jotting down things on every scrap of paper that Brother Ayusi could find. Finally, the book Russian Revolution was not prepared or intended, I think, by Walter for publication. These were lecture notes that grew out of the lectures he was giving while he was employed at the University of Dar es Salaam, and also in preparation for what would never become his job at the University of Guyana, where he was to teach a course on revolution, not teach a course in African history per se. There are lecture notes that the family has lodged at Atlanta University on the Haitian Revolution, and perhaps at some point someone could approach the family for permission to also transcribe and elaborate on those notes so that we can see a publication, perhaps a shorter publication than the Russian Revolution, that brings to a more general readership Walter's thoughts and elaborations on the Haitian Revolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, Sister Roberta, for those comments. And I don't see them as you presented them, of course, as you said, as a critique of such. But I think it adds to the breadth of what Rodney was about. In that, I would stick to the information you present about his focus on Tanzania, wherever he was, wherever he found. I think one of the things, the point I was trying to make is the breadth of Walter in terms of, you read something like the History of the Guyanese Working People. It's a text that fits in the academy. It follows all the standard procedures of academic writing. It's not how Europe underdeveloped Africa. There are footnotes, there are references. You can go to a research library, follow up what he does. It's, but he's making a powerful argument about the history of the working people in it. Point I'm trying to make is that Walter remained a brilliantly trained historian in the process. And it's not accurate that while he was in Tanzania, he simply wrote about Tanzania wherever he found himself. In fact, Walter was writing in academic journals like the Journal of African History while he was in Tanzania on events that were taking place in the 16th, 17th century in the regions of West Africa. He was also writing on Central Africa in the period. He's actually writing on the Caribbean also at times. But what is certainly the case is that he always sought to immerse himself in the particular context in which he found himself. But I think that it is simply one of the distinctive things about Walter Rodney. Yes, I know that while he was there, he was collecting notes, involved in a dialogue, but I guess the message I'm trying to get across is as someone, in fact, Rodney always used to say that fundamentally his particular contribution is an intellectual in a sense, but he's an intellectual who is involved and rooted with the people. And the role of an intellectual is involved in the production of ideas, not an academic. He earned a living sometimes somewhere as an academic, but he was an intellectual, important distinction, I think myself. So he was continually engaged in trying to extend that understanding of what an intellectual is about. So I say that I don't think we necessarily need to separate these different experiences. I think it was part of a flow that we found in Walter Rodney in the period.
So just very quickly, if you want to make a quick point, because now finally we have more people in the room that want to say something, so maybe we can also include them in the conversation. So if I'm going to ask you to please, Joseph, to just stick a pin there, and you will be the first one to take the mic after we give the mic to the room right now. So over here we have somebody, and then Prof. Cooper over there.
Christine Cummings. I'm not really speaking directly to the presentations, but I have a question. Given the point that Horace made about the hurricanes, the climate change, etc., and I'm wondering if any work has been done in the Caribbean on the role of hurricanes and other weather phenomena on our revolutions. Because certainly I'm what they call a weather tete in terms of hurricanes. And I've found that a lot of hurricanes are linked to uprisings in our region. In other words, the level of dislocation brought about by climate events. How have they impacted social and political development?
Yes, Carolyn Cooper. I know it might be impolitic to raise this point, but I just want to follow up from what Horace was saying about Walter's failure to deal with gender and, gender issues. And when I look at the conference program, it's only about 25% of the presenters are female. And I know that the organizers have no control over the people who offer papers. So maybe you just didn't get any women to that who wanted to present papers. And I think we have to be conscious as we organize conferences about the kind of representation of gender in the way subjects are dealt with. I don't know.
Yes, and we can take one more. Yes. Hold on. We're using the microphone because we are recording the session.
It's very interesting that one should mention gender.
Oh, sorry. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Fitz what or something.
Okay.
It's very interesting that you should mention gender, Ms. Cooper, because one of the most important interventions or one of the most important exhibitions that I saw on the around the time of Rodney's death was his correspondence with Elsa Gavaya. It was in the library, and so that brought home to me that, as has been said here, that this was a serious historian, because you don't talk to Gavaya in a rambling way. And I found that one. In fact, I went home to another Guyanese and said to him, or one of my Guyanese friends, and said to him, he actually was still in touch with Gavaya, who was still considered the premier historian of the time. That's all I have to say.
Okay, we are going to give back the word. But just one quick thing about the gender. Yes, of course, the organizers have no control over who submits proposals, and I don't know which ways we can implement to encourage that. But I will just say something very quickly. I was in Spain in the 90s, and we had groups of working on African consciousness and so on. It was always like young men involved in this. However, this summer we had a summit, a conference commemorating the 50 years of independence in Equatorial Guinea, and most of the people of African descent that I saw there, they were female. I don't know how it has happened, but basically I don't think it was directed by anybody. It was out of their own motivation or whatever it is that inspired them to become more politicized and more involved in these issues. Yes.
All right, but how do you explain the illustration that was used for the conference?
It's a very good question for which I don't have a good answer.
Yes,
So I'll
you
leave it
know,
there.
Susan is saying that it's a picture that came out of the Gleaner, but if the Gleaner represented the march in that way 50 years ago, we don't also represent the march in the same way 50 years later, because the politics of gender
I
is
think
completely different.
that's a very good point, and I think we have to make amends. Now, please, I think Joseph wanted to say something.
Yeah, on the first input, your name again, I forget. Robert, okay. Thanks. I appreciate the input and the feedback. I think people need to know about the variety of Walter's publications, so that point is taken. Angola certainly, not just the variety in terms of country case studies, but he was conscious of where he published them. The Angolan one, the most accessible one, is a book chapter edited by Ranger. Michael also talked about another publication on the jihads. That was in an African journal. I think it's Journal of the Historical Society of Nigeria. There's another one on gold and slaves in the Gold Coast, also published in an African journal, Transactions of the Historical Society of Ghana. And the ones of Tanzania are numerous. So that point is taken, and I appreciate it, and people need to know the variety. The second thing about the history of the Guyanese working people being complemented by interactions and interviews, that point is also well taken and consistent with his method. I read in the opening presentation, we must first of all identify the total system, then you look at our societies in great detail, then return to examine the relationship between this total society and ourselves. If you are going through that operation, then you obviously need to interact, take interviews, and ground with the subjects that you are hoping to have transform and self-emancipate.
Right. I do want to add that I think Callan's Cooper's point is extremely well taken, and what I sense to be a sort of righteous indignation is also entirely appropriate in circumstances. And some of us actually have been, were in discussion privately when we looked at the program, and we do have to be more attentive to these matters. And in part, I suppose, it has to do with funding, that if one had money, one could actually identify people and invite them and sponsor them. But perhaps those funds were not available, in part. Yes, I'm also pleased to learn that there's material on the Haitian Revolution in the Rodney papers. I've looked at those papers myself, but I was not in their entirety. But I'm pleased to learn that there's something on the Haitian Revolution there, and next time I happen to be in Atlanta, I'll take a look.
Yes, thank you. On the question that you raised on the climate change and the Caribbean, I did not get to this section of my presentation where the Caribbean governments are in the lead in writing that report of the IPCC. And the Caribbean governments, under the rubric of small and island states, have been pushing. But even the most recent report that came out a month ago, it is clothed in the neoliberal language of resilience. And the report does not deal with the fact that they're talking about 1.5 degrees centigrade, but many parts of Africa are already over 2 degrees centigrade. And what I was trying to get at is that what is needed is drastic intervention. Now, in the first chapter of the history of the Guyanese working people, that chapter is entitled internal and external constraints on the working peoples. And the main point he was doing in that chapter was talk about how the canals, the polders, and the natural environment was made livable. So the humanization of the environment, which is part of self-emancipation, what I was getting to, is the task of a new mode of economic organization. And we cannot get to that new mode of economic organization within the current capitalist system. And so the ideas that we've seen in that chapter is what I am recommending to Caribbean scholars that are talking about reparations. Because reparations and reparative justice is now being taken up by the state. But the state themselves are not dealing with the question of how to repair the natural environment and humanize the natural environment. And therefore, there needs to be that kind of work going on within the university about the repair of the environment, so that the state, in talking about reparations, is only talking about one aspect of reparation, which is legitimate, because the Caribbean, as a cross-section of human society, is giving the lead inside of Western Europe. The European left will never talk about reparations, because the European left always see slavery as contributing to the education of black people. So, but the Caribbean left must take reparations beyond where the governments are, to take reparations into the school books, into the textbooks, into the reorganization of villages and communities in the Caribbean. That's the point I would want to make.
Well, thank you very much to the four presenters. That's all we have time for. So we're gonna, just keep them. Yes, sorry.
I know we are over, but I had a gem for Sister Roberta, which is...
Very quickly, please.
Very quickly, yes.
Out of time.
And this is in relation to the statement you made about this interaction between Walter and the people and how that informed his dialogue and his writing. This one comes from a different space, but it comes from the ways in which he took the archives to the people. There's a speech that Walter gives, and he addresses the crowd, and he says, he's speaking about, tonight I'm going to speak to you about a man called Roller, a doctor. He can't recall his name. You may not know him because he came from the East Coast, Berbice, but I will leave his name in your memory after tonight. And he goes on to speak about Roller as being the first black medical doctor to be qualified and returned, and how he was discriminated against by the colonial state, and links that to the struggles they faced against the regime in Burnham in the particular period, and the rights that they actually fought for as a people and how they're being denied. The ways in which, and you can go to read History of the Guyanese Working People and see how that appears in it. It had not yet been written, but I'm talking about the historian as rebel and revolutionary.
And on that note, we just come to the end of this panel. Thank you very much again. We have a